Hello everyone, my name is David. I'm known as Unity Freedom and welcome back to my channel. And today's topic I'd like to talk about is the topic of suffering. And I know it's a pretty interesting topic, but I have a new spin to it. So stay tuned and I'll share with you my insights about what I found out about suffering. So what is suffering? Something comes to mind, in my mind, in terms of suffering is that I'm having a lot of pain. I'm suffering from something. It's a physical condition. Because when we relate to suffering, we always think that it is a physical condition that causes us to suffer. For example, if we work in a difficult job and in a difficult environment, then that's a physical condition that makes us feel like we're suffering from the environment. Or something in regards to money. If we don't have enough money, then that too can cause us suffering because money is a physical condition. We have little money, then that causes us some sort of suffering. If we have a lot of money, that can also cause us another form of suffering. That is, we're afraid that someone is going to scam us or steal from us. That kind of suffering. So a lot of people associate suffering from some form of outside physical condition. What if I tell you that suffering is not an outside condition only? What if I tell you that suffering is just an experience that is happening in your mind? So when you have that experience of suffering in your mind, what does it mean by having an experience in your mind? So you imagine a story of a person. Say you take a person and the person wants to build a house. And the person builds a house on a remote island. So the person doesn't have any skills building the house. So the person hires some workers, some architects, and engineers to help build the house. And then, of course, the person goes over the blueprint with the architect, the engineers, and the workers in the hopes that they will help him build the ideal dream house on the remote island. So some months and years passed by, the house was built, and the person who owns the house and the island comes in and take a look at the house. And of course, the person has a particular mind, a particular expectation that he expects or she expects the house to be built this way and to have this sense of the feeling that the house should be this way and it should feel this way or that way. But when the person got into the house, something is different. The things that the person believe or should expect from the house is different from the final product. And so the person contacts the architect and the engineers to complain. How come the house is built in a way that's not up to the expectation of the person that asked them to build the house in the first place? And so they argued. The architect says, I followed your blueprint. And that's how the house is built, according to the blueprint. But the owner says, no, you didn't interpret the blueprint correctly. And then the owner complained to the engineers that somehow the toilet wasn't flushing properly, or the water isn't up to pressure. And the engineers, the plumbers, they told the owner that's the way it is. They built it up to specification. And that's all they could do, built it up to specification. So right now what you have is a scenario where the owner has a certain expectations of how the house should feel and should be built, and how the plumbing should work. But the engineers and the architect said this something differently. The architect is basically fulfilling what the blueprint of the house should be and make sure that it's built up to code. And the engineers and the plumbers make sure that it's plumbed correctly and the building is again built up to code. So these three people have different expectations, and their experiences are not invalid. Their experiences are valid. Each of the experiences from these individuals are valid. But what is different is that they don't all match. So why is that? Why is it that everybody's experiences do not match? It's because we have what is called free will. We have the free will to have a certain expectation. And it doesn't have to be the same expectation as other people. It can be different. It can be conflicting, but at least the expectations are different, and that makes us unique. And of course, when people have that sort of expectations, they want others to align with their expectations as well. So the owner wants the builder or the architect to build a house exactly to what the owner have in his mind or her mind. But of course, the architect wants the owner to accept the fact that the architect did what the architect is meant to do, to build a house up to code and to fulfill the blueprint. So these two people have different expectations. In their minds, they're both different in terms of experience. And so the conflict arises, and that's where the experience differs. When the experience differs, for example, that the owner has a certain expectation. This is the experience that the owner expects to experience from the house. When that experience does not match the experience of what the owner expects, that gap is suffering. The experience itself, suffering is an experience, but the gap between the actual experience versus the expected experience is what determines the level of suffering. So if the gap is greater between the expected experience and the actual experience, then the person suffers more. If the gap between the experience and the expected experience is narrower or smaller, then the person suffers less of the suffering. So if you look at it in a way, outside being you're not the owner, you're not the architect, and you're not the engineer who built the house, you're just a bystander. And you look at a house, you might look at it and say, hey, that's a beautiful house. But do you have the experience of the owner, the architect, and the engineers, and the workers who built the house? You don't. You don't have those experiences because you're just a bystander. So when you look at a house, do you suffer from the same experience as the owner or the builder and the workers and the architect? Certainly not, because your experience is different from the experiences or the expectations of the architect, the engineers, the workers, and the owner who commissioned the house. So would you say that, are you suffering by looking at the house? Of course not. You're not really suffering because you don't have the same expectation as the owner, the architect, the engineers, and the workers. And so, since you don't have the difference between your expectations of the house, which is not aligned with the owner, you don't suffer. You just look at the house and you look at it, it's a beautiful house. You might experience maybe enviness that that's a beautiful house and you want to have that house, but you don't have the same suffering as the owner who has a certain expectation of how the house is built. And so experience and suffering are both hand in hand, and they happen in the mind of an individual. So when you look at yourself and say, what sort of suffering I am experiencing right now in my life? And you can ask the question, oh, let me see what sort of expectations I have in my job versus the expectation my boss have on me. And you will realize that you both have different expectations. And you will realize that the gap that you try to make to close the gap between yourself and your boss, they may not be possible. And so you are suffering because you're trying to close the gap between yourself and someone else, someone else's expectation. And that experience, the difference, the gap between your expectation of your experience compared to somebody else is what determines suffering. Let's take another example. Let's say you have a $500 bicycle, and then you have a certain expectation and experience owning that $500 worth of bike. And then you have a $5,000 bike. And then you have also a certain expectation of what that $5,000 bike is. So the gap between owning a $500 bicycle than a $5,000 bicycle, physically, that's a big gap because that's a big price difference. But in your mind, it depends on how you see the bike. If you see the bike as being the physical value of the bicycle, then obviously you will suffer because you are associating the bike value compared to the more expensive bike. But if you don't see the bike value, like you don't see the sticker price on the bike, you see two bikes and they are put side by side and you look at it and you don't see one is $500, the other one is $5,000, you will notice that there is no gap because you don't have a physical value to compare the gap between $500 and $5,000. So in a way, your experience differs by seeing a price tag between both $500 and $5,000. So the physical aspect of suffering is that it gives you that confirmation of the gap. But is the confirmation of the gap outside of yourself or inside yourself? Because if it's inside yourself, you see the price difference. One is more expensive than the other. And obviously, you want to own something more expensive because you think that's better. But if you were to look at both bicycles the same way, do you see a difference? Then if you don't see a difference, would you feel there is any suffering in your mind? Because there are two bicycles. They may not be identical in performance, but let's take that away. Just two bicycles without any price tags. Do you feel a sense of suffering? So that's what I discovered myself. That when I look at things in life, I just look at it and I realize that the things I compare outside myself really have no merit. If I were to look at two things and they don't have anything to identify from, this is more expensive and this is less expensive, I don't suffer. I don't realize that, okay, this one is more expensive than the other. But as soon as I see some identification or some confirmation that, okay, this bike is $5,000 and this bike is $500, I feel like I'm left out because the number is bigger than the other. If I don't get a number, more expensive number, like a $5,000 bike, I feel like I'm left out. I'm missing out. But that all happens in the mind. The mind is telling you you're missing out. But if you leave out the price, then you have nothing to compare. And when you have nothing to compare, how would you feel that you're missing out? So that's the message I'm here to give and let you ponder. If you have any questions you want to ask, or you want to elaborate, you want to ask more, please feel free to leave a comment. And I will see you next week, and I'll share more insights of other things. Okay, thank you for watching my video. Bye for now.